Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak on Bill C-206, an act to amend the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act. And it's my colleague, the private member's bill, my Conservative colleague, the member for Northumberland, Peterborough South. First, as the official opposition shadow minister for agriculture and agri-food, I want to congratulate the member for Northumberland, Peterborough South, and thank him for this bill. The member is well aware of the challenges faced by farmers and producers in his riding, and he's clearly in touch with their concerns. I believe his constituents can look forward to his long and fruitful service on their behalf. Madam Speaker, I have heard many concerns from farmers and producers in my own riding of Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, and how the carbon tax negatively affects their cost of production, and also how it puts them at a competitive disadvantage against imports coming from our neighbors to the south, especially given our close proximity to the U.S. border. Madam Speaker, I turn now to the bill itself. If this government refuses to support this bill, they will send a clear message to Canadians generally and to Canadian farmers, ranchers, and producers in particular. The message the Liberals will send is that they do not care how their carbon tax negatively affects Canadians and our domestic food security and production. The Liberals will also show how sadly out of touch they are with Canadian farmers. First, I want to point out to this House the current situation with the Liberals' carbon tax and producers. Farmers are already exempt from paying the federal carbon tax on gasoline and fuel oils, which includes diesel fuel, where these are used for agriculture production on the farm. Let me be clear, this bill is only proposing to extend this existing federal carbon tax exemption for farmers to include propane and natural gas. Last March at the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food, and again on a video conference last June, the Agriculture Minister suggested that the farmers' federal carbon tax payments on propane and natural gas are less than 1% of their expenditures and insignificant. But that's just not the case. As you might imagine, the Liberals' carbon tax on propane and natural gas is far more than that. Madam Speaker, many farmers and producers use propane or natural gas to heat their barns and dry grain and oilseeds. Last November, the Parliamentary Budget Office released a report on the carbon tax showing that farmers, ranchers, and producers would pay $9 million for the remainder of just this fiscal year, plus $226 million over the next 4 fiscal years for using propane and natural gas in their operations. For that period of time, that's a total of $235 million. Madam Speaker, it appears the Minister of Agriculture has a problem not just with math, but with arithmetic. So let me press further on the arithmetic and math. The profit margins for most Canadian producers are very narrow. For most Canadian farmers, there is very little room for error or additional input costs. For Canadian farmers, the Liberals' carbon tax is an input cost on their production, and most producers are price takers, not price setters. That means that farmers have no way of recovering what they pay in the Liberals' carbon tax from the next stage of the supply chain. To be clear, the Liberals' carbon tax takes from most Canadian farmers' profits and from their family's standard of living. Canadians count on a reliable supply of food on their grocery shelves. And this just in, Madam Speaker, that food must come from a farm. If a farm is not profitable, the farm must shut down and the farmer must leave the land. As Canadian farmers are driven off the land and out of business, less food is produced here in Canada. A reliable supply of food must be found elsewhere, and Canadian food sovereignty is put in doubt. Madam Speaker, by bringing forward this bill, my colleague has shown that he understands the challenges farmers face. But the minister's resistance to extending an exemption to the Liberals' carbon tax shows just how out of touch he is with farmers. But the Minister of Agriculture's problems don't stop there. The minister has recently suggested that farmers should innovate so as to avoid using propane and natural gas in their production. But for many farmers, propane and natural gas is the only option. Propane and natural gas are widely used by producers and farmers for heating their barns and drying their grains and oilseeds, and there are no other options available currently. Ironically, at a recent meeting of the Keystone agricultural producers in Manitoba, the minister indicated that farmers could finance the purchase of a new, more efficient gas or propane grain dryer using the Climate Action Incentive Fund. So on one hand, she's telling farmers to find a viable alternative, and on the other, she's proclaimed that her government will pay for it. So which is it? Could the minister be any more out of touch with farmers? Madam Speaker, the existing federal carbon tax exemption for farmers' use of gasoline and fuel oils raises another question. Compared to gasoline and fuel oils, both propane and natural gas are very clean fuels in respect of their emissions. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, the carbon dioxide emissions from diesel and heating oil are 16% higher than for propane. CO2 emissions for diesel and heating oil are 37% higher than the emissions for natural gas. The CO2 emissions for gasoline are 13% higher than for propane and 17% higher than for natural gas. And according to the Canadian Propane Association, and I quote, studies have found that propane can emit up to 26% fewer GHGs than gasoline in vehicles and 38% fewer GHGs than fuel in oil in furnaces. Propane's end-use GHG emissions are significantly lower than gasoline, diesel, coal, and heating oil. When upstream life cycle emissions are taken into account, the case for propane becomes even stronger, unquote. That is the science. So, Madam Speaker, here's the question. Why is this government refusing to extend the federal carbon tax exemption to propane and natural gas when they emit less carbon dioxide than gasoline or fuel oils? Madam Speaker, this is clearly not a science-based decision. Not only does this government have trouble with mathematics and arithmetic, and not only are they out of touch with farmers, they have trouble with the science too. So finally, Madam Speaker, let me draw to the attention of the House to the wider consequences of this government's failure to be in touch with Canadian farmers and producers. Let me underscore the problems with the Liberals' inability to understand the issues around farmers' profit margins. As farmers' profit margins move towards zero or cross over to become losses, it becomes more and more difficult for farmers and ranchers to stay on the land and in the business of producing food and feedstocks. How many times have we seen on this side of the House and heard from farmers and ranchers whose families have been on the land for generations that they could no longer afford the uncertainty of knowing whether or not this year would see profit or loss? How many farm families who have been on the land for generations have shut down operations because their children saw little future in staying on the land with losses year over year? How many farm families have seen their standards of living gradually falling as costs pile up and the market prices for their commodities are static or in a downward trend? Madam Speaker, some of these Canadian families have been on the land for 3, 4, 5, or more generations. Despite producing a reliable supply of food for all Canadians, Canadian farmers are faced with a Liberal government that seems to think that food security is only about food banks. The Liberals are wrong. They are putting the ability of Canadians to produce food and Canadian food sovereignty in doubt. Despite being prudent managers of the land they hold, Canadian farmers, ranchers, and producers see little recognition from this Liberal government for their contribution to maintaining a safe, clean outdoor environment. And despite being conscientious taxpayers who contribute to the treasuries of their municipality, their province, or to the federal treasury, Canadian farmers, ranchers, and producers are faced with a government that believes that they should pay yet even more in the form of the Liberals' carbon tax. Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, we say enough. Madam Speaker, on this side of the House, Conservatives believe that the challenges Canadian farmers face should be top of mind. Conservatives know that agricultural producers may be Canada's most important natural resources producers. Conservatives know Canadian families rely on Canadian farmers for a steady, secure, reliable supply of food on grocery shelves. Conservatives understand that farming is both a way of life for many Canadian families and their business. Conservatives understand the way of life requires that farming be profitable. And Conservatives understand that ranchers pay property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes. Conservatives understand that agricultural producers cannot afford to pay the Liberals' carbon tax on fuel used for production, including propane and natural gas. Conservatives offer Canadian farmers, ranchers, and producers a bright future for their families and for the generations that will follow in their steps. Madam Speaker, for those reasons, as the official opposition Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food, it's my honour and privilege to support the member for Northumberland Peterborough South and his bill C-206. Thank you.